Today is actually the 13th, well, it's officially the 14th now of March, but I'm actually doing a makeshift of my defense, my dissertation defense, because there was no recording of the defense act, my defense. So I'm actually going to do a makeshift version of it. And so, for the most part, the title of the presentation is Emerging Adults' Perceptions of Toxic Family Leadership. It's a case study. The background and rationale had to do with the fact that there were no studies or have not been studies done on toxic leadership from the perspective of the emerging adults. However, there has been studies done on toxic leadership from the perspective of organizations within the military and within the schools, high school, elementary school, etc., and colleges and universities. With that being said, the rationale behind my study is that I wanted to explore the lived experiences associated with the perceptions of toxic lead or emerging adults. Moving on to theoretical orientation, Bowen's family systems theory was the overarching theme associated with my study. And with that being said, toxic leadership and emerging adulthood were two constructs that actually integrated with Bowen's family systems theory. Murray Bowen was a psychiatrist who actually did a study at Georgetown for roughly 5 years. And so based on his studies that he actually did while working with families, the whole unit, he actually learned or devised his first 6 steps or 6 tenets, if you will, associated with his theory. And then from there, in the 1970s, 2 additional ones were added, which were the emotional family system and societal emotional process. With that being said, Maury Bowen was actually, he defined family as an emotional unit, an emotional system. And so he devised these particular tenets to actually speak to how members within the family unit worked together. And so for the most part, the particular tenets were very explicit. For example, the emotional withdrawing is when a person grows or goes away physically to avoid conflict, constant conflict, the continuation of conflict that is present within the family unit. And that serves as an example, and I'll talk more about that as I get down to the specifics associated with the findings. And then I'd like to add that the purpose of this particular study is that I wanted to explore toxic leadership through the lens of emerging adults. Overall, to help individuals understand how emerging adults view toxic leadership and the impact that toxic leadership has on their risky behaviors. I have 5 research questions which actually guided the study. The first of which is, what are the characteristics of family leadership through the lenses as it pertains to emerging adults who reside in substance abuse group homes? How do they define or give the characteristics of toxic leadership as? Secondly, what is the role of toxic leadership within the family as it pertains to emerging adults who reside in substance abuse group homes? Thirdly, how do emerging adults who reside in substance abuse group homes, how do they describe risky behaviors? And fourthly, how do emerging adults who reside in substance abuse group homes, how do they explain the impact that toxic leadership has on their risky behaviors? And finally, how does the explanations differ pertaining to the gender and the ethnicity of the toxic or the emerging adults? The review of literature. I have several strands. I have the actual overarching theory, which is Bowen's family systems theory. And I use, out of the 8 tenets that's associated with said theory, I actually utilized six of them, or five of them, I should say. Sorry, I'm trying to avoid the light there. I actually utilized six of them. Pardon me, five. I keep saying six, but five of them. And the five were the differentiation of self, which basically is when an individual begins to, they're thinking independently for themselves while realizing the independence, or the dependence, I should say, that they have on other members in the family, but they are wise enough and strong enough to make their own decisions and not caring or being overly concerned with the thoughts and opinions of others. While on the other hand, the person that is less differentiated really is concerned, or really does concern himself or herself with the opinions of others. And so the second one is the second tenet within Boyd's Family Systems theory that I utilized was the emotional cutoff. And again, that's where an individual grows from the family. They go away in order to avoid additional conflict that is present within the family. And although they go away, it doesn't mean that the problem has been resolved. Thirdly is the multi-generational process. That has to do with individuals that are, well, primarily three generations of individuals, if you will, and that the family pass on themes and patterns from generation to generation. Most oftentimes, these patterns are transmitted from the parent to the child. And then I like to also say that fourthly, the nuclear family emotional system was a tenet that I focused on for my study, and that deals with the fact that there are four many or subsystems or basic family systems that are found within this nuclear family process, and they are the impairment of the child. And that's when the parents are actually speaking of a child in a negative way. They're stressing over that child and thinking about that child excessively, and what happens is that child it becomes impaired and to a point where the schoolwork, or the emerging adult in this case, could be impacted in their schoolwork, etc., and can become stressed as a result of that. And also emotional withdrawing, or emotional cut off, or withdrawing, I should say, is also a part of it, where the family members are not communicating with each other. The husband and wife may have gone from a separation to a divorce, and so now they're not communicating with one another. And then I'd like to also say that the third one has to do with the dysfunction of a spouse, and that one spouse is trying to control the other. It's pointing fingers and placing blame on one spouse, and that dysfunction in that spouse, or dysfunction spouse, is also trying to maintain harmony and peace. And so as a result, they go along to get along. And then finally, there is the marital conflict. That basically is where individuals, the husband and wife, they're no longer communicating. And so there you have it. The communication is stopping. They're withdrawing. They're not communicating with each other. And then finally, the societal process, the societal family process, is one that actually where the emerging adult, regardless of how frequently the parent may be giving them responsibilities, the emerging adult will have a tendency to rebel against that, and the parent they're not sticking to the decision, if you will, of honing in on holding the line, if you will. And if their parents make a comment, or if they say they're going to do a particular thing, that they should not give in to the child. But in this instance, in the societal process, that's what they're doing. The parents are giving in instead of holding the line. And so what happens is that child begins, or in this case, the emerging adult begins to rebel. Then the second part of the strands is the emerging adulthood, which has 5 tenets. Jeffrey Jensen Arnett actually coined the term in 2000, and according to Jeffrey Jensen Arnett, the emerging adults were responsible for they actually went through 5 stages, or ages, if you will. So they self-identification. So they begin to focus on things that they were identifying with. So they're thinking about on the political spectrum, identifying themselves as pertains to that. What are their beliefs there on a religious level? So they're thinking about those things. So there's self-identification. Then there's instability. And that's where they may be making a life decision, but they're vacillating. And so they make a life decision and something comes along which causes the emerging adult to then make a change as it pertains to that decision. And so they find themselves vacillating, constantly making a change to their life decision. Thirdly, they're feeling in between. So maybe they're not claiming to be an adolescent, but they're not fully an adult. And so they find that they may be making some decisions, but not quite all as from an adult perspective. And so they're feeling in between. And so they're really trying to find themselves in that regard. And so that's feeling in between in a nutshell. Moving right along to the self-focus stage. That's pretty much where an individual focus on themselves, the emerging adult, with regard to what it is that they may want to accomplish. What are their goals? What is it that they are wanting to do? So they're self-focusing. They may be obviously putting themselves first, the other people on the sideline or on the back burner in order for them to focus on themselves. And then finally, there's the possibility stage, and that has to do with them thinking about their career, understanding what it is that they want to accomplish, and they're sticking to that, they're honing in. My third topic has to do with, or my third major strand has to do with toxic leadership. Toxic leadership was actually looked at in 1996 is when Wicker actually began to look at toxic leaders. She started looking at toxic leadership within the organizational arena, if you will. So she started looking at organizations, wanted to understand how is it that toxic leaders were successful. And she defined toxic leaders as those that are maladjusted, malcontent, and they actually strived as getting along, basically tearing down others. She defined bullies, street fighters, as well. She considered them to be toxic leaders as well. And it's quite interesting. I will say that sometime after, in 2003, Bullis and Reed actually headed up a study with the U.S. Army because Thomas E. White, who was then an officer within the Army, wanted to actually understand the climate within the Army. And as a result, he wanted the study to be done. And so, again, that study was headed up, and what was uncovered, if you will, was the terminology used to describe the leaders within the military. And so toxic leadership was the term that was utilized, and it began to spread, hence the usage of the word toxic leadership. Jean Lippman Blumen also she studied toxic leaders and toxic leadership. And in 2005, 2004. And she, specified the fact that toxic leaders succeed in tearing others down, that they are malicious individuals. And so she focused on organization. She looked at schools, colleges, universities, in order to understand the phenomenon or the concern there. And I want to say that risky behaviors are, and this is associated with Garner and Steinberg, these particular risky behaviors are associated with driving while under the influence, doing a drug of choice while under the influence, actually doing drugs and alcohol, and having unprotected sex are all considered risky behaviors. And then finally, the substance abuse group home, which was one of my major strands. It was the final one, or is the final one. That one had to do with the places such as the treatment facilities, the Oxford homes, etc. Places in the community that actually focused on, their primary focus was on the success, if you will, the sobriety for the emerging adult in this study. And so as a result, that's what it's about. Moving on to research design. My research design, let me just start by saying, from a social constructivist point of view, the social constructivist view indicates that individuals are shaped by their experiences, by their real experiences. And so that is the philosophy. The research type associated with the social constructivist or the constructivist worldview is the qualitative, I should say, type of research. And then the methods that are utilized are open-ended questions. And so as a result, I utilize qualitative study. I wanted to actually speak with these individuals, understand their lived experiences, get their stories and perspectives from them verbally. And so as a result, that's what happened. As it pertains to the role of the researcher, it was important for me to obtain the thoughts associated with the emerging adults. I wanted to get their feelings as it pertains to their lived experiences. And I wanted to make sure that as it pertains to reflexivity, that I understood that I bought biases and understood exactly what those biases were that I bought to the study. And when I understood that, it was my responsibility, my role as a researcher, to make sure that I alleviated my biases and I did that by asking unbiased questions. And so it was important for me to make sure I didn't interject any of my personal experiences, any of my observations, or anything as it pertains to toxic leadership. I was there solely to collect data from the participant, and that's what happened. That was my role as a researcher. Now, as it pertains to my participants, I actually started with 14, ended up with 12. 3 of them were in their teenage years. One was 18, 2 of them were 19, and the others were in their 20s. I also had 5 females, and 7 males. And then I had 10 Caucasians, 1 Black, and 1 Mexican. Okay, as pertains to my participants. Now, moving right along to the data collection procedure, I actually collected data by interviewing them, asking open-ended questions. Each participant actually experienced 2 interviews with me. And so when they experienced those interviews were recorded. By the way, the participants did sign a consent form, which gave me permission to interview them, but also gave them permission to reach out to the college, to my professor at that particular time, Professor Weber, and to also reach out to myself. My contact information was there, the school's information was there, and also to let them know the purpose of my study and what their role was as far as the study was concerned. They took a signed copy, and I also got a copy with their signature, which is being kept in a safe place. And so with that being said, once the data was collected, again, I moved on to the actual analysis piece of it. And oh, by the way, as it pertains to the data collection, I also took descriptive notes. So on top of having the recorded sessions and having those audios, I also had descriptive notes as well. Moving on to the data analysis piece, I actually had, once I collected the data, it was necessary for me to organize the data. And so I took those automated pieces, the automated or recorded versions of the interviews, and I transcribed all of them, even the 14, of the 2 of which had to be dropped. So all of those were keyed in, and they were all typed in, I should say. And then I took that information, and I had to then organize the data. So I organized it, and then I was able to then read it. So I was able to go through, and I'm reading the data. I'm looking for the a priori codes, which are pre-existing codes associated with the literature. And I'm also looking for the emergent codes, right? The emergent ones, those themes that emerged from the data as I was collecting, right? And so I also realized that as I was reading the data, again, I was beginning to code the data and then to generate descriptions associated with the participants as well as the people and the themes. And so once I did all of that, I'm going back and forth. I'm looking at the responses that the participants had actually given, and I'm looking at their verbiage and associating their verbiage with the actual, the major strands, if you will, or the attributes, the themes and the attributes, in order to make an alignment with them. And so I actually had to take the long sentences, and shorten them and condense them into 3 or 4 word phrases. And then from there, I was then able to convey that data in a form of a chart. And so it was easy then for me to be able to depict what was what as it pertains to the major strand, the attribute, the theme, and the attributes associated with the theme. And then from there, I was able to interpret the data. Okay, moving right along to the trustworthiness and transferability, it was important for me that the participants understood that their sharing with me was going to be confidential. That I wouldn't be sharing their name and things of that nature will all be confidential. So trustworthiness had to do with the fact that the research findings were true and accurate. Member checking was a part of that to ensure that there was trustworthiness. This particular study is also transferable, which was important, an important part of the trustworthiness and transferability piece, and that if based on similar circumstances and similar conditions, that this study could be applicable to individuals that may be living in a different city, a different state, and a different treatment facility, but are considered emerging adults. So it is transferable, this study. And it is also, the findings are actually confirmable, in that the findings are, the information was taken solely from the feedback of the emerging adults. With that being said, I'm moving on to the results piece, and here I have identified through the major strands some of the responses from the participants. And so, for instance, participant G indicated that if things were not going the way that he wanted them to, he would just blow off the handle. Okay, that had to do with differentiation of self. And again, participant G did not display high differentiation of self. It was a very low differentiation of self. He would overreact if things didn't go his way. He would get angry, and that's a low differentiation of self. And that he obviously cared what people thought. He cared about the opinions of others instead of having the wherewithal to be able to move forward in spite of. And so secondly, the emotional cutoff, participant A basically indicated that they began to disassociate themselves with their family. They began to isolate. And that's what emotional cutoff is. Again, that is the growing away physically and emotionally from family members. Thirdly is the multi-generational transmission process. Participant D indicated that they were angry. He was angry with his father. He felt that his father screwed him up because it's 3 generations of alcoholics. So it was the participant's father, and then the participant's grandfather. All 3 of those males actually exhibited the same behavior, the same thing, the same pattern that was drilled down from generation to generation. And the participant's point was, and as I read his specific response here, is that now he feels as though he's doing the same thing to his son. And so there you have that multi-generational transmission process. Moving right along to the nuclear family system, emotional system, participant L asserted that their mom didn't and dad didn't talk. And so they were, this particular case, the mother was living with the son, and then you had one of the addicts who was actually in and out of the treatment facilities. So what was happening, according to this participant L, is that he actually felt that he was talked about in a negative way and done so excessively, and that basically equates to impairment, which is one of the 4 basic family units, if you will, that falls under, or systems that falls under the family emotional system. So there's one of the basic systems there. And so also you found that what the people not talking, that meant that they are emotionally withdrawing from each other. They're not communicating. People in the family are not talking. Grandmama lives alone. Nobody talks to anyone. According to participant L, this is what he had to say. And so thirdly, what we found within this same, with this same participant, is that there was marital conflict, that the parents weren't communicating anymore, nor were they living, they were residing together. And so that was a part of that tenet. Moving along to the societal emotional process, participant I declared that in their early years they weren't taught how to actually move on, if you will, in life. They weren't taught how to handle things, and so discipline stopped. And as a result, he began to rebel. This participant began to rebel in the 6th grade. And so remember here in the societal emotional process, that's when individuals began to lie to their parents in order to get away or around any of the responsibilities that the parents may have identified. The parents are not holding the line. So the parents are maybe saying one thing, but they're not sticking to their word. They're not keeping their word. And so that sends a mixed signal, if you will, to the emerging adult that is trying to be parented, or that is in this situation where the parents are trying to parent him or her. So moving right along to the understanding of the understanding of self as an emerging adult. The self-focus stage, participant A indicated that they stopped their network of friends. They really wanted to do something different this time. So they were focused on themselves, wanting to do something different, wanting to improve. Participant I, as it pertains to instability, actually indicated that there has been a few different places that I've lived over the past year. So this participant lived with his father. That didn't work out. He moved out. Moved with his ex. That didn't work out. He moved out. Moved back in with his father. That didn't work out. So he wound up homeless. So he was unstable rather, and experienced that instability as it pertains to love, because the relationship with his ex didn't work out. He moved in and out of there a few times. And then also the instability showed up in the living arrangement. Okay, now moving right along to identity exploration, this particular participant identified himself very closely and realized, well, he identified himself with the love of preparing food, if you will, culinary arts. He realized as he identified, as he explored his identity, he realized that he had a love, if you will, an appreciation for culinary. And so as a result, this is something that was a passion of his. Moving along to filling in between, participant C indicated that sometimes he felt as though he couldn't make his own decisions. Like, okay, at one minute I can make decisions, I can have an opinion, other times I can't. Which is it? So he felt that he was always being forced to vacillate or make a decision as it pertains to when he could and couldn't have an opinion of his own. And moving on to the possibilities, participant B stated that he actually kept, or she rather, wanted to trace her genes. So pardon me for looking up. I have the actual presentation here, and I am talking at the same time and looking up primarily 100% of the time. But as it pertains to the results, I have to share with you verbatim, or I'm paraphrasing in this case, what it is that the participants actually shared. So again, participant B wanted to chase her dreams, and she realized that the addiction would curtail that ability. And so moving on to toxic leadership in families, physical and social abuse, narcissism and abusive supervision as it pertains to the tenets associated with SMIT on the toxic leadership scale. I associated narcissism and abusive supervision with the physical and sexual abuse. And so participant J stated that no matter what happened, that they would have ended up being beaten by their mom, by the grandmother, every single day. Participant I, or E rather, indicated as it pertains to emotional toxic environment, which I associated with the authoritarian leadership, and that that authoritarian leadership always has to be in control. They want control, and they basically shun the idea of a person having their own thoughts, their own ideas, their own way of completing goals and tasks. Okay, so here the participant indicated that I can't even talk to my mom. I don't even think anybody could hold a conversation with her. And he said that it's hard because she feels that she always needs to be outspoken and everything has to go her way. That is a common trait associated with the authoritarian leader, okay? Moving along to teens and children emulating their parents and unpredictability. Here we have participant G that indicated their stepmom was unpredictable, and that all of a sudden she's feeling herself getting beaten, fussed at, yelled at, beaten every single day. So unpredictability is associated with that teens emulating the parents trait, because that unpredictability, first of all, that grandmother or the mother here was an alcoholic, and so is the actual participant. So there's where the emulation comes into play. Now, the unpredictability piece of it is from the actual leadership, the toxic leadership construct of the toxic leadership scale, is that the unpredictability piece is where the participant feels as though they can't necessarily have a conversation or feel as though that particular leader is approachable. It's hard to determine that. And with the unpredictability, as a part of the equation or part of the characteristic associated with that toxic leader, they actually allow their feelings or the mood to control the environment. And so it becomes quite tricky, to deal with that. And so as a result, that's what happened there. Finally, we have the drug introduction by parents. I associated self-promotion there because participant D, the dad wanted to get credit. Self-promotion means that the person wants to get credit regardless. They just want to get credit for things that wasn't even theirs, or in this case, it was, because the parent introduced their child to heroin. He taught them how to do heroin, taught them how to do drugs. So he introduced the drug to his son, the parent did, which was obviously toxic. Now, moving right along to the continuation of the results, risky behaviors of emerging adults. So we have participant D declaring that while shooting up heroin, he wound up in an ambulance because he was doing drugs while he was behind the wheel. Well, remember, reckless driving is a risky behavior. Moving along to illicit drugs, participant I indicated that just by being home or being on heroin, that actually propelled the participant to want it more. That was the only thing that the participant thought about, and that was just getting the next fix. And then there's the alcohol abuse. Participant A indicated that he'd actually been on drugs since the age of 15. He's actually been struggling in that regard, not drugs and alcohol, as a matter of fact, since the age of 15. And then you have the other substance abuse, and that is participant E, who actually had a cesarean. She actually was given pain medication, given pain pills while in the hospital, and then she continued to take pills after the hospital, and after the pain was gone, she just began to continue on. It started her desire, her fixation, her addiction to the drug or to the actual opioid in this case. And so it became a snowball effect. She indicated that while doing pain pills and shooting up, then she went to heroin, then she was shooting up coke, and then again pretty much shooting up anything that she possibly could get her hands on, okay? And moving on to the sexual relationships, this was a theme that emerged from the data, and that several of the participants indicated that they actually prostituted in order to get the money, to earn the money, if you will, to obtain the money to actually purchase their drug or alcohol of choice. Moving along to the substance abuse homes of emerging adults, the importance of substance abuse and the importance of sustaining recovery, I should say. Participant C indicated that I'm here recovery because I'm tired of living in the drug environment. They indicated that they're there to learn new skills, meaning at the facility for which I collected data. And so that's what participant C said. Participant K indicated that I came here somewhat voluntarily. So this particular strand had to do with, or particular tenet for the substance abuse homes and emerging adults, is voluntary and mandatory treatment, okay? And so again, participant K indicated I came here somewhat voluntarily. I had not been court-ordered, nor did my family require my being here. Participant D stated I checked in myself and called and made an appointment. So this was something that they were self-focused on. This was something that they wanted to do. They took the responsibility to check themselves in. Absolutely wonderful. Moving on to the connections to questions. What are the characteristics of toxic family leadership? So the characteristics are, according to the emerging adults who reside in substance abuse homes, one of the characteristics is that several of the participants said that they experienced or witnessed physical abuse. Well, we know that that is a trait of toxic leadership, okay? And then moving on, 6 participants, they were molested or raped by a family member, someone that they trusted. And that gets back to toxic leadership as it pertains to narcissistic behavior. Narcissism as it pertains to one of the constructs associated with toxic leadership on the toxic leadership scale. Those individuals that are narcissistic, they have an entitlement way of being. They feel that they are entitled to the things that they want, bottom line. Okay, and in this case, those individuals that violated these participants, these family members that violated these participants, they were narcissistic as it pertains to the definition. Moving on, some participants indicated that sexual abuse had occurred in their family for generations. As a matter of fact, I had several participants to indicate that their grandmother was molested, their mother was molested by their father, and now so were they. Moving along to the second question. What is the role of leadership within the family as described by emerging adults who reside in substance abuse group homes? Well, several of the participants indicated that they needed discipline, that they felt that the role of leadership should include discipline, should also include encouragement and support, of which they said they didn't receive. Secondly, they felt that the role of leadership is to serve in a positive way, to serve as a positive influence. And thirdly, they indicated that parents as leaders should not do drugs with their children. They should not do it. And this was something that they plainly stated. They shouldn't do drugs, nor should they be introduced to a drug or alcohol by their parent. And then moving along to the third question, why do emerging adults who reside in what do emerging adults who reside in substance abuse group homes describe as risky behaviors? Well, they describe risky behaviors as the drug and alcohol usage, right? Each participant informed me that at least one person in their home did drugs. And on the other end of that spectrum, one participant informed me that there is only one person in the home that is not doing drugs. So everyone else is either doing a drug or alcohol. And then moving along, several participants confessed to driving while intoxicated. Okay, obviously that is a risky behavior. And then also, and thirdly, they indicated that several participants rather indicated or confessed that being on drugs or being addicted to pills and alcohol, or the pills and the opioids, I should say, their interest was piqued based on them witnessing their family doing or taking an opioid. And so it piqued their interest and led them to participating in that as well. Moving on to question 4. What do emerging adults who reside in substance abuse group homes say that toxic leadership, how does toxic leadership impact their risky behavior, or say that it does impact their behavior? And so what they say here is that okay, so 4, okay, I thought I've already done this one, that's why I paused, so pardon me. So several participants declared that they had no discipline and no direction. Okay, I did just do that one. Several of the toxic leaders participant driving recklessly, and the parents should not have introduced them. Okay, so I did do 4. So now I'm going to move on to 5. 5, how do emerging adults' explanations differ by race and ethnicity and gender? Well, they didn't differ. The emerging adults realized, and they all said that leadership should be a positive influence on the emerging adults, on people that are being led by leaders. And they also felt that, well, they confessed that they knew that they were not only hurting themselves, but they were hurting their family members as well. And I'm going to take a minute to go back to number 4, just in case I skipped something. But question 4 is, how do emerging adults who reside in substance abuse group homes explain the impact that toxic leadership have on their risky behaviors? So the impact is toxic leadership led participants to driving recklessly and using drugs and alcohol. That was one of the impacts. Also, some participants blame their addiction on their parent, right? They're saying that had their parents not introduced them to drugs or alcohol, then they wouldn't be in that facility interviewing with me. And then they also said that they declared that they didn't have any discipline or direction from their parents. They didn't get any discipline at all. they were never told no. So had they had discipline, had they been told no, they feel like it would have been a better outcome for them. And maybe they would not have experienced drug and had an addiction to drugs and alcohol. Okay, so moving on to the implications as I begin to bring this recording to a close. Implications actually speak to organizations and facilities. So hopefully organizations and facilities who actually work with families can help develop a policy or address issues associated with adults, emerging adults who face leadership, a toxic leadership within their communities. And maybe these said organizations and facilities that work with emerging adults can actually consider how to create optimal environments that will sustain the wholeness of emerging adults. Okay, and then perhaps scholars in leadership studies and family studies could actually better understand the interconnectivity that exists between the Boyne's family systems theory and the constructs of the toxic leadership and emerging adulthood. And then also, emerging adults are better able to name their trauma and understand the impact of their risky behaviors and can move forward with the possibilities of healthy and whole lives. And then finally, emerging adults who participated in this study, they now know that individuals within their age group are considered emerging adults, and they understand that their behaviors of drinking while intoxicated, drinking and driving, or drinking while doing their drugs are considered, or those particular acts are considered